the best graffiti went the fastest. It got the most attention. It got the most heat on itself. And, you know, if it wasn't in a position of pride for the neighborhood and they took ownership of it, it got eliminated. So fundamentally, on a survival instinct, I wanted the work to last. The way to make the work last was to have people identify with it. The way people identified with it is it's just, to coin a phrase, relatable content, right? So it made sense for me to make work that made sense to people.
When you say you wanted people to relate to it, who are people? Are people other graffiti writers, or are people the general public?
The people is the general public. You know, I painted my first real foray into the larger world outside of my neighborhood was I painted a stretch of Market Street in West Philadelphia from 63rd to 45th Street. It's maybe 20 blocks, maybe 30 blocks. And it runs, there's an elevated train that runs down this Market Street. And on both sides of the elevated train, just perfectly situated, really unlike very few places in the world that I've seen, the rooftops are right at eye level to the person sitting on the train just looking out the window. And my brother, I have an older brother, he's 4 years older. Oh man, he hated it. He hated the fact that I wrote graffiti. It was like such a threat to him and his worldview. And it didn't matter to me. You know, it was more than exciting to me to challenge him that way. But his girlfriend took the train every day to her job in the city, and she saw my graffiti and she related to it. And she's like a nursing assistant, you know? She's like as straight as it gets, and she's as square as it gets. And she's like, I mean, she's hip, but she's like, you know, she represents society and proper citizenry. And she's responding to my work. And my work wasn't making I wasn't making graffiti about dental assistants. I was like just painting my name, but the color, the placement, the energy spoke to her. And I realized it was speaking to everybody at some point. And, you know, I wanted to keep that going. And sometimes I did it too much, sometimes I did it too little, but that connection became the most valuable thing. Like that became the goal from the start. And by having that goal, I was insulating the cable of power from the outside forces that wanted to cut it. You know, it was like...
Why do you think, well, one, do you think that graffiti has a utility to the public sphere? And then two, why do you think that, you know, like the municipalities and just the society in general kind of has like such a strong backlash? You're talking about Philadelphia and how they had this whole thing against it, even though it's such a big part of Philly.
It is now.
And the history of the city. So, so those are the two questions. What do you think it has utility, and why such the strong backlash?
The utility of graffiti is to say I was here. And it's to mark a time and a space that a person was present in a location. In the Philadelphia context, you know, that's really the raison d'etre of graffiti in Philadelphia is I was here. And I was here with this much style, and I was here with this much attitude and joie de vivre, because we speak a lot of French in Philly. But the main utility of graffiti is a declaration of existence. Now, related to that, the authorities hate graffiti so much because of that declaration. They hate that declaration. It's ironically in the city of the Declaration of Independence, people declaring their existence is a really powerful threat. And it was fundamentally, it was on property lines. It was on, you know, property holders, stakeholders, municipality, just extended to the property. The people paying property taxes complained that their property rights are being violated. And they felt that for the money that they were spending on property taxes and everything else, they deserved to have their walls cleaned. So it became it's interesting how angry people get at graffiti just on the strict sense of property damage. Like, people have this very capitalistic notion of, I own this property is mine. You defiling my property equals murder. It equals like the most murderous rage like a man can bring to bear, possibly more than his family members, but probably the same amount as if his family members were being threatened. They really equate property value with the sanctity of life. It's a very confusing nexus that there's no way to talk people out of it. What I did as a graffiti writer and later as like a writer and a spokesperson, my own way, is to say, a mark on a property doesn't really commit damage. I mean, there's a really interesting legal term that we'll get into, but landlords have been applying paint to walls for thousands of years to increase the value of their properties. It's like the first thing you do when it's time to sell your property is you paint the walls. So conversely, if Cornbread or Cool Earl apply a coat of paint to your wall, you'd be really hard pressed to explain how that is damaging the wall. Nobody's ever going to convince me that paint damages property, because it does not damage property. It damages maybe your perception of your property, but it doesn't physically do anything to the property. In fact, it may strengthen it. It may add to it. It may increase its value. It may do a lot of things, but it's not damaging. So, but fundamentally, they call it damage. They want to call it damage. They want to call it destruction. They want to categorize it as something that is negative. And we had a very interesting few years in Philadelphia from like the first article that was written on Philadelphia graffiti appeared in maybe 1970, 71, but like by, I think it's June or July of 1971, there is a full color magazine story in the Sunday magazine of the Inquirer. The Inquirer is our local, like our prestigious publication. It's our New York Times, but it's like, we have our tabloid, which is a daily news, like the Post and the News in New York. The Inquirer is a little more august. It's a little more upscale. Right now, they're all the same website, philly.com. But when the Inquirer published this magazine profile about wall writing, not graffiti, wall writing, in 1971, they cast the die that, these are really interesting, dynamic creators that are changing their city, they're changing their neighborhoods, and they're changing themselves. The whole narrative was established in 1971, 2 years before Taki in New York. The Taki spawns Pen Pals article in New York Times. And it made superstars out of Bobby Cool and Titty, and I forget who else. There was a couple other guys, but Cornbread was front and center. They made these guys superstars, made them look cool, photographed them catching tags, set them up in a photo studio, made them look glamorous. They were glamorous. They didn't have to do anything. They wore their street clothes, and their street clothes were marvelous. But there was an understanding editorially, journalistically, that these guys are really interesting. They were doing something new. And if you really analyze, there's a great book called Crimes of Style. Farrell, I forget his first name, but he really breaks it down. He does like a really important sociological breakdown of how like the media and the government work together to criminalize, they conspire to demonize and criminalize graffiti, when it really is just a crime of style. It's a crime of like, it's not a crime. It's your opinion versus another person's opinion. And if you don't believe me, anywhere you could look for marketing or for any kind of like direction of where the youth is at, you're going to see graffiti now. It's like a major part of our landscape now. Whereas for years, and I was on the front lines of it, you know, publishing a magazine, for years people were so mad about it. They didn't want to depict graffiti. They didn't want to show it in a positive light. They hated the fact that graffiti writers got good press. The fact that they called it graffiti was a way of them controlling it and making it something that, you know, was in their control. The writers called it wall writing. You know, I still think wall writing suits the purpose. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so graffiti has a lot of appeal to me as a word and as an action. It's like graffiti has utility as a declaration of existence. The authorities are really threatened by that declaration. They do not want to see it's threatening for a few reasons, you know, and really, like, you can break it down any way you want, but it's a threat to the prosperity and peaceful well-being of the government and the property owners of the municipalities.